When legends are born, the Hegemony Commander's sensors swept across the medical bay, cataloging every life form present. Behind Marcus, the wounded beings lay still, some unconscious, others watching with wide eyes as death incarnate stood in their doorway. The silicon-based warrior towered over Marcus by nearly 3 feet, his crystalline body bristling with integrated weapon systems. Biological inferior, the commander spoke through a voice synthesizer that made his words sound like grinding stone. You will step aside. These contaminated life forms will be cleansed. Marcus didn't move. His legs shook from blood loss and exhaustion, but he planted his feet firmly on the deck plating. I can't let you do that. The Hegemony warriors behind their commander shifted, their weapon systems humming to life. They had expected fear, panic, perhaps desperate pleading. They hadn't expected quiet defiance from a wounded human standing alone against impossible odds. You cannot stop us, the commander stated, his optical sensors focusing on Marcus with mechanical precision. Surrender now and your termination will be swift. You're probably right, Marcus admitted, wiping blood from his mouth with his good hand. But here's the thing about humans, we don't surrender when people are counting on us. What happened next would be debated by military historians for centuries. Marcus, wounded and exhausted, launched himself at the Hegemony commander with nothing but determination and desperate courage. The Silicon warrior, caught off guard by the seemingly suicidal attack, fired his plasma cannon a fraction of a second too late. Marcus rolled under the plasma bolt and drove his shoulder into the commander's leg joint, the one vulnerable spot he'd noticed in the creature's armor. The impact sent vibrations through the Silicon warrior's crystalline structure, disrupting his internal weapon systems for crucial seconds. The medical bay erupted into chaos as the other Hegemony soldiers opened fire. But their commander was in their line of fire, and their advanced targeting systems couldn't get a clean shot. Marcus used those precious moments to grab a medical laser cutter from his supplies. The only weapon available in the sterile environment, the tool wasn't designed for combat. But Marcus had learned to improvise during his years of military service. He sliced through power cables in the commander's leg, sending electrical feedback through the warrior's entire system. The creature stumbled, temporarily blinded as his optical sensors overloaded, but Marcus knew he couldn't win this fight through force alone. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and bleeding from multiple wounds. What he needed was time, and perhaps a miracle. The miracle came in the form of emergency blast doors slamming shut, activated by the ship's failing automated systems. The other Hegemony warriors were cut off from their commander, who found himself trapped in the medical bay with an apparently insane human and 17 wounded council members. Impossible, the commander snarled as his systems rebooted. No biological inferior can match Hegemony combat capabilities. Marcus backed toward his patients, the medical laser still in his hand. That's your problem right there. You keep calling us inferior, but you don't really understand what that means. The commander's weapons powered up again, plasma cannons glowing with lethal energy. Enlighten me before I remove your contamination from this universe. You see weakness where we see strength, Marcus said, breathing heavily as adrenaline fought against his body's failing systems. You see primitive emotion where we see purpose. You think caring about others makes us inferior? But it's actually what makes us dangerous. The Hegemony warrior fired, but Marcus was already moving, using his knowledge of the medical bay's layout to stay one step ahead of certain death. Behind overturned medical equipment, he continued talking, his voice carrying through the smoke and sparks. You want to know why humans are really feared in this galaxy? It's not because we're the strongest or the smartest. It's because we're willing to die for complete strangers. Because when the galaxy abandoned me here, I didn't abandon them back. Plasma bolts turned medical equipment into slag around him, but Marcus kept moving, kept talking. The wounded council members watched in amazement as this single human, rejected by their governments and abandoned by their military, fought an impossible battle to protect them. Your species fights for conquest, Marcus called out as he dove behind another piece of equipment. Our species fights for each other. That's why you'll never understand us, and it's why you'll never truly defeat us. The commander paused his assault, his tactical programs running calculations. Something was wrong with this scenario. The humans should have been dead or surrendering by now. Instead, he was fighting with a ferocity that defied all logical combat models. "You speak of victory," the commander said, his voice uncertain for the first time. "Yet you are one against many. Your defeat is mathematically certain." Marcus emerged from cover, the medical laser in one hand and the emergency beacon in the other. Blood ran down his face from a head wound, but his eyes burned with unshakable determination. "Maybe, but here's what your calculations missed." He activated the beacon, sending an emergency signal into space on all frequencies. "Humans don't fight alone. We never have." High above the battle, something impossible was happening. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace around the damaged diplomatic vessel, not council ships, but human vessels. Freighters, passenger liners, even civilian craft, all converging on the emergency signal. The beacon Marcus had activated wasn't just calling for help. It was broadcasting on the frequency used by human merchant vessels, letting every human ship in the system know that one of their own was in trouble. And despite having no official standing in the galaxy, despite being rejected by the Council, those ships were coming. "Attention hegemony forces," came a voice over the ship's communication system. "This is Captain Sarah Rodriguez of the human freighter Iron. Well, you are surrounded by 47 vessels of the Human Independent Fleet. Stand down immediately." The hegemony commander's optical sensors flared as his long-range scanners confirmed the impossible. Dozens of human ships had surrounded his forces, appearing as if from nowhere. Most were civilian vessels, converted cargo ships and passenger liners that shouldn't have posed any military threat, but they were human ships, crewed by beings who shared Marcus's stubborn refusal to abandon their own. And as the commander's tactical analysis programs ran their calculations, a disturbing truth emerged. These weren't merchants and civilians anymore. They were an impromptu battle fleet, united by something the hegemony couldn't quantify or understand. "This is Commander Zextar of the Hegemony 3rd Strike Force," the Silicon Warrior broadcast. "You are interfering with a lawful cleansing operation. Withdraw immediately or face destruction." Captain Rodriguez's response came back immediately, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that Marcus had shown. "Commander, you have exactly 30 seconds to evacuate that medical bay before we demonstrate why the galaxy considers humans to be dangerously unpredictable." The countdown began, and Marcus found himself smiling despite everything. Around him, the wounded council members stared in amazement, as they finally understood what they had rejected when they voted against human membership. It wasn't just a species they had turned away. It was a people who would cross the galaxy to save a single soldier, who would risk war itself rather than abandon one of their own. The hegemony commander's weapons powered down as his tactical systems delivered their final analysis. He was facing not just one wounded human, but the collective fury of an entire species that had just learned one of their own was in danger. His strike force, designed to crush individual vessels, was suddenly facing an enemy that fought as one massive, uncoordinated but utterly determined organism. "This engagement is concluded," the commander announced, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "Hegemony forces are withdrawing." As the Silicon Warriors retreated, Marcus finally allowed himself to collapse against a medical bed, exhaustion overwhelming his adrenaline. Around him, the wounded council members were stirring, their injuries stabilized by his care during the long battle, but the real victory wasn't in the medical bay. It was in the space around the damaged ship, where 47 human vessels maintained their protective formation, proving to the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength had never been their technology or their military might. It was their refusal to let each other fall alone. The Council's reckoning 6 months after the incident at Zarian, the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with tension. Representatives from 847 different species filled the vast chamber, their varied forms creating a tapestry of galactic civilization. But today, all eyes were focused on the central podium where Ambassador Veltar stood, his insectoid features grave as he prepared to address the assembly dot in the observer gallery. Sergeant Marcus Chen sat quietly in his dress uniform, the Medal of Galactic Service gleaming on his chest, an honor that had never before been awarded to a non-council species. His left arm, fully healed now thanks to advanced medical treatment, rested comfortably at his side. Beside him sat Captain Sarah Rodriguez and several other human representatives, present by special invitation for this historic session. Honored delegates, Veltar began, his voice carrying through the chamber's sophisticated translation systems. We gather today to address a grave error in judgment that has brought shame upon this council and endangered our very survival as a galactic community. The hall fell silent. Even the usually chattering whisper singers of the melodic consortium stopped their constant background harmonies. This wasn't a typical council session about trade disputes or territorial boundaries. This was about the future of galactic civilization itself. 6 months ago, Veltar continued, this council voted unanimously to deny humanity membership in our organization. We cited their aggressive nature and primitive emotional responses as incompatible with our vision of advanced galactic society. Today I stand before you to explain why that decision was not only wrong but catastrophically misguided. On the chamber's massive holographic display, images appeared from the Viridian Dawn incident. The damaged ship, the medical bay where Marcus had made his stand, the evacuation pods that had carried council members to safety while leaving him behind. The delegates watched in silence as the story unfolded. When the hegemony attacked our diplomatic mission, our first response was evacuation. Veltar's voice carried notes of shame that his species rarely displayed. Our military escort fled. Our seasoned diplomats abandoned ship. Even I, with 40 years of diplomatic experience, prioritized my own survival over the mission's objectives. The images shifted to show Marcus working in the medical bay, treating wounded beings from species that had rejected his own. The delegates could see his injuries, his exhaustion, but also his unwavering determination to save lives. One human remained, Veltar said. Sergeant Marcus Chun, the cultural observer we had reluctantly allowed aboard our ship, stayed with 17 wounded council members when everyone else fled. He treated their injuries, defended them against hegemony forces, and ultimately risked his life for beings whose governments had unanimously declared his species unworthy of our company. Ambassador Korath stood in the Silicate Confederation section, his crystalline form reflecting the chamber's lights in prismatic patterns. I was there, he said, his usually perfect diplomatic composure cracking with emotion. I watched this human work with a shattered arm, bleeding from multiple wounds, never once considering his own safety while our people lay dying. When I offered him the last evacuation pod, he refused, knowing that his patients would die without his care. Murmurs rippled through the assembly as delegates processed this information. The Aquarian representative, her gills fluttering with distress, spoke up from her environmental suit. My cousin was among the wounded that day. She owes her life to Sergeant Chun's actions. How can we continue to exclude a species that produces such individuals? The holographic display shifted again, showing the moment when human ships had appeared to rescue the Viridian Dawn. The delegates watched as 47 civilian vessels, hastily armed and crewed by volunteers, had faced down a hegemony strike force to save a single human soldier. This is what we failed to understand about humanity, Veltar explained. Their primitive emotional responses are actually sophisticated social bonds that allow them to coordinate actions across vast distances without central command. When Sergeant Chun activated his emergency beacon, every human ship in the system responded, not because they were ordered to, but because abandoning their own is simply not part of their nature. Commander Zextar himself materialized on the podium via hologram, his silicon form still impressive even in projection. The hegemony had agreed to provide testimony as part of the peace negotiations that followed the incident. I have fought biological species across 17 sectors, the commander stated matter-of-factly. I have conquered worlds, eliminated fleets, and crushed entire civilizations. But I had never encountered anything like what I faced in that medical bay. The human displayed tactical capabilities that defied our combat models, not through superior technology or physical strength, but through absolute refusal to accept defeat when others depended on him. The commander paused, his optical sensors sweeping across the assembly. More significantly, when faced with our forces, the human civilian ships did not scatter as predicted. They formed a coordinated defense pattern despite having no military training and no central command structure. Their willingness to die for a single individual created a tactical situation that our strategists are still analyzing. Captain Rodriguez was invited to speak next. She stood calmly at the podium, her simple merchant captain's uniform contrasting sharply with the elaborate diplomatic regalia surrounding her. "Honored delegates," she began. "You say humans are too aggressive for galactic society. You're right, we are aggressive. We're aggressively loyal to our friends, aggressively protective of the innocent, and aggressively opposed to injustice. If those qualities make us unfit for your council, then perhaps your council needs to examine what it truly values." The captain's words struck the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in her statement. "Sergeant Chen didn't stay behind because he was ordered to," Rodriguez continued. "He stayed because abandoning wounded people was unthinkable to him, even when those people represented governments that had rejected his species. That's not primitive behavior. That's the kind of moral courage that true civilization should be built on." The debate that followed lasted for hours. The Hivemind Collective argued that human unpredictability made them dangerous allies. The scholarly ascendancy worried that human emotional decision-making would disrupt careful diplomatic processes. The corporate syndicate questioned whether humanity's tendency to prioritize individual lives over practical considerations would interfere with efficient governance, but other voices rose to counter these concerns. The surviving wounded from the Viridian Dawn had formed an unlikely coalition, speaking passionately about the human who had saved their lives. Species that had never agreed on anything found themselves united in their support for humanity's membership. "We have spent centuries perfecting our diplomatic protocols," declared the elder voice of the contemplative order, a being so ancient that his species had helped found the council itself. "We have created elaborate systems for maintaining peace, preventing conflict, and ensuring orderly governance. But in all our wisdom, we forgot the most basic principle of civilization. Those who will not sacrifice for others do not deserve the protection that others provide." The vote, when it finally came, was unlike anything in council history. Instead of the usual careful political maneuvering and negotiated compromises, delegates spoke from their hearts about what they had witnessed. The Zarian incident had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own values and priorities. When the results were announced, the chamber erupted in unprecedented chaos. The vote for human membership was 631 in favor, 198 against, with 18 abstentions. It wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive enough to change everything. As Marcus stood to acknowledge the council's recognition, he found himself thinking about the 17 beings he had refused to abandon. They were alive, healthy, and sitting in this very chamber because one wounded human had decided that some things were more important than personal survival. "Honored delegates," Marcus said when the chamber finally quieted, "humanity accepts membership in the Galactic Council with one understanding: we will never abandon our principles to fit in. We will be loyal allies, fierce protectors of the innocent, and implacable enemies of those who prey on the helpless. If that makes us difficult partners, so be it. But it also makes us the kind of partners you want beside you when the galaxy faces its darkest hours." The applause that followed wasn't polite diplomatic acknowledgement. It was genuine appreciation from beings who had finally understood what they had almost lost through their own prejudice and fear. In the weeks that followed, the Council would discover that accepting humanity meant accepting a fundamentally different approach to galactic civilization. Humans didn't just join existing institutions, they transformed them through their presence, bringing an energy and moral certainty that had been missing from galactic politics for centuries, the hegemony. Meanwhile, quietly withdrew from several contested systems, their commanders having concluded that fighting humans was an unpredictable and potentially catastrophic proposition. Not because humans were militarily superior, but because they fought with a F. The Galactic Council's mistake, the transport ship Viridian Dawn, shuddered as another plasma bolt struck its hull. Inside the cramped medical bay, Sergeant Marcus Chun gritted his teeth and continued working on the wounded Zephyrian diplomat despite the chaos around him. Blood from multiple species stained his uniform, and his left arm hung useless at his side, shattered by debris from the initial attack. "Human, you must evacuate immediately," chittered Ambassador Veltar through his translator device. The insectoid's compound eyes reflected genuine concern as he watched Marcus struggle with his injuries. "The hegemony forces will breach this section within minutes." Marcus didn't look up from the blue-skinned Aquarian he was treating. "Not leaving anyone behind, sir? That's not how we do things." He pressed a medical patch against the diplomat's gill slits, stopping the hemorrhaging that would have killed her within minutes. Around them, other members of the Galactic Council's diplomatic mission huddled in terror as the ship's lights flickered with each impact. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months ago, these same beings had voted unanimously to exclude humanity from the Galactic Council. They'd called humans too aggressive, primitively violent, and unsuitable for civilized galactic society. The vote had been 847-0, with humanity's application rejected so thoroughly that it became a case study in diplomatic humiliation. Yet here he was, the only human aboard a council diplomatic vessel, serving as a cultural observer, essentially a glorified janitor with medical training. The council had reluctantly agreed to let one human join their mission to the disputed Zarian system. More as an experiment than any sign of respect, another explosion rocked the ship, and the artificial gravity flickered. The hegemony, a militant faction of silicon-based life forms, had ambushed their peace mission. While the council representatives panicked and their military escort fled in their faster ships, Marcus had remained in the medical bay, treating the wounded from multiple species. "The evacuation pods are launching," announced the ship's AI in its calm, synthesized voice. "All personnel must reach designated escape vectors within 4 minutes." Through the medical bay's small viewport, Marcus could see the sleek council escort ships disappearing into hyperspace, their crews having abandoned the slower diplomatic vessel without a second thought. The evacuation pods were jettisoning rapidly, each one carrying council members to safety. Ambassador Korith, a tall, crystalline being from the Silicate Confederation, materialized beside Marcus's workspace. His usually perfect diplomatic composure was cracking like his mineral-based skin under stress. "Sergeant Chun, there's a pod waiting for you. Your injuries require immediate attention." Marcus finished sealing the Aquarian's wounds and moved to the next patient, a small, furry creature whose species he didn't recognize but whose pain was universal. "How many wounded are left in this section?" 17, Korith replied reluctantly. "But the pods can only hold 5 beings each, and the remaining pods are ... He paused, his crystalline features shifting uncomfortably. "They're designed for council member physiology. A human might not survive the journey, might not?" Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting the ambassador's faceted ones. "What about these wounded? Will they survive if I leave them here?" The answer was written in Korith's silence. The medical bay's life support was already failing, and the wounded couldn't be moved without proper treatment. Without someone to stabilize them, they'd die long before any rescue could arrive. "The hegemony doesn't take prisoners," Veltar added quietly. "They consider biological life forms to be ... inferior. They'll execute any survivors." Marcus nodded, understanding the full weight of the situation. He looked around the medical bay at the wounded beings from a dozen different species, the same species whose governments had unanimously rejected humanity's bid for council membership. The same beings who had spent months treating him like a curiosity at best, a barely tolerated primitive at worst. The ship's hull groaned under another barrage. Through the walls, they could hear the distinctive whine of hegemony boarding craft attaching to the hull. The silicon-based warriors would breach the ship within minutes, bringing their plasma weapons and their absolute hatred for organic life. "Go," Marcus said simply, turning back to his patients. "Take the last pods and get to safety." "Sergeant Chun," Corey's voice carried something that might have been respect. "You don't owe us this. After how the Council has treated your species." Marcus was already moving to the next wounded being, a reptilian creature whose scales were rapidly losing their color, a sign of severe trauma in his species. "Maybe not. But this is what humans do. We don't abandon people who need help, even if they wouldn't do the same for us." The boarding alarms began screaming as hegemony forces breached the outer hull. In the distance, they could hear the distinctive sound of plasma cutters working through the ship's internal barriers. The evacuation pod's launch sequence was nearly complete. Ambassador Veltar hesitated at the medical bay entrance. "If we survive this, if we make it back to Council space... I will remember what you've done here." "Just get yourselves to safety," Marcus replied without looking up. "And maybe next time your people vote on humanity's membership, remember that we judge people by their actions, not their politics." The last evacuation pod launched just as the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in, bathing the medical bay in an eerie red glow. Marcus worked by the dim light, moving from patient to patient, doing everything he could to keep them stable. His own injuries screamed for attention, but he pushed the pain aside. The sound of plasma cutters grew closer. Soon, the hegemony forces would breach the medical bay, and Marcus knew exactly what would happen next. The silicon-based warriors showed no mercy to organic life, viewing biological beings as a plague to be eliminated from the galaxy. But as he worked, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: peace. This was what humanity was truly about. Not the advanced technology or the military might that the Council feared, but the simple, stubborn refusal to abandon those in need. It was the same quality that had driven humans to risk their lives for strangers throughout their history. From ancient battles to space exploration. The medical bay's main door began to glow as hegemony plasma cutters started working through it. Marcus finished stabilizing his last patient and stood up, facing the door with quiet determination. He was tired, wounded, and outnumbered by an enemy that would show no mercy, but he wasn't afraid. He had done what needed to be done, what any human would have done in his place. If this was how his story ended, at least it would end the right way. The door exploded inward in a shower of molten metal and plasma energy. Through the smoke and flames stepped the towering forms of hegemony warriors, their crystalline bodies gleaming with built-in weapon systems. Their leader, a massive creature that looked like a walking mountain of black silicon, surveyed the scene with sensors that glowed like stars. Marcus stood between the warriors and his patients, empty-handed but unafraid. Behind him, 17 wounded beings from across the galaxy watched in silence. Finally understanding what humanity truly represented, the hegemony commander raised his arm, plasma cannons charging with deadly energy. In the red emergency lighting of the failing ship, the standoff began that would change the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be human.